You are suspended in the corner of a glass enclosure that has never surprised you, not once, not in any direction. The walls are always where they were. The air is always the temperature it was adjusted to be. The substrate beneath you holds the same tension it held yesterday and the day before that. And you exist inside this consistency not as something trapped, but as something completed, a system that found its equilibrium and stopped needing to search. You are a spider, and the fundamental logic of your existence is not movement but position, not action but readiness. You have placed yourself exactly where you need to be, and now you wait, because waiting is not passivity for you, the way it is passivity for other animals. Waiting is the work. Waiting is the entire architecture of your survival. Your web is an extension of your nervous system, a structure that does your sensing for you while you remain still. And prey comes to it, has always come to it, because your human maintains the conditions that produce prey, introduces it deliberately, keeps the temperature where flight is possible and hunger is constant, and the small lives that sustain you keep moving through the air at intervals that have always been sufficient. And your human is as invisible to your experience as the filtration system or the glass itself, present only as the mechanism that keeps the cycle functioning, not a relationship, not a presence you register as significant, just the unnamed force behind the continuity of everything. And then that force stops, not loudly, not with any physical change you can immediately detect, just stops, the way a sound stops, leaving a quality of silence that is different from the silence that preceded it. Though you cannot know this yet. You cannot know anything has changed because nothing inside the enclosure has changed. The glass is still glass, the air is still air, your web still holds its geometry with the precision you gave it. And so you remain where you are, because remaining is correct. Remaining is always correct until something tells you otherwise, and nothing is telling you otherwise, not yet. The first day is identical to any other day that did not include prey. And days without prey are not unusual. Your body is designed for exactly this. For the long intervals between input, your metabolism is not a fire that needs constant fuel. It is something slower and more patient, a process that can stretch a single meal across a duration that would starve most other animals. And so the absence of the feeding that would normally have come by now registers as nothing more than a longer than average interval, which is within the range of normal, which requires no response. You wait. Day 2. The enclosure begins to drift, not structurally, not in any way that involves the glass or the substrate, but chemically. The humidity shifts by degrees that your body detects before your behavior reflects them. The temperature moves slightly outside the band it has always occupied, not enough to trigger relocation, not enough to constitute a signal worth acting on, but enough to register as a change in the quality of the environment, a loosening of the precision that has always defined this space. And you make micro adjustments, small repositioning movements that place you at the point where conditions feel closest to what they were. Because you are sensitive to gradients in a way that does not require conscious processing, your body finds the optimum the way water finds level, automatically, without deliberation. Day 3. And now the absence of prey has extended past the range of normal into something else, not alarm, because alarm requires a referent, requires the memory of a pattern being violated. And you do not process time the way that would make 3 days feel like a violation. You process input, and there is none. And so you wait longer. Your metabolism drawing down its reserves with the patience of a system that was built for exactly this contingency, extracting every available unit from what you last consumed, running on minimum, conserving everything. And this is where you diverge from almost every other animal in a failing system, because most animals respond to scarcity by increasing activity, by moving, by searching, by expending energy in the pursuit of replacement energy. And you do the opposite. You become more still, more efficient, more committed to the position you have already chosen, because your strategy has always been to make the world come to you, and you have not yet received sufficient information to abandon that strategy. Weeks pass inside the enclosure, and the change that arrives is not the change you were waiting for. It is not prey. It is something smaller. The enclosure is no longer sterile in the way it was maintained to be. Microscopic life that was always present but always controlled has begun to expand into the space that control has vacated. Mites moving through the substrate, tiny organisms navigating the air in patterns too small to have previously mattered, fungal threads extending across surfaces that were cleaned on a schedule that no longer exists. And you detect all of this because your web detects all of this, and something shifts in how you respond to the information your web returns. What was previously noise, vibrations too small and too irregular to warrant response, begins to be signal, because signal is defined by what you need, and what you need has changed. You rebuild the web, not in a moment of decision, but in the gradual way that behavior shifts when the environment shifts, the geometry changes, the strands move closer together, the capture zone becomes denser and more sensitive, optimized not for the large prey that no longer comes, but for the small prey that is now everywhere, and you catch it, something tiny, almost nothing, but not nothing, and you consume it, and the enclosure that seemed to be emptying is revealed to contain an entire world that was always there but always suppressed, a world operating at a scale below the one you were oriented toward, and you reorient, not through choice but through the only mechanism available to you, which is that what works gets repeated and what doesn't gets abandoned, and catching small things works. And so you catch small things, and weeks become months, and the enclosure is no longer a controlled environment and not yet a natural one, but something stranger than either, a sealed system finding its own equilibrium without external input, populations of microorganisms rising and crashing according to their own dynamics, the substrate becoming biologically complex in ways it was never designed to be, and you are not just surviving inside this process, you are part of it, your predation shaping which populations persist, your silk restructuring the physical space, your stillness creating zones of safety that other organisms learn to navigate around. You have become a feature of the ecosystem rather than a resident of an enclosure, and then the enclosure fails, not suddenly, not in any dramatic structural collapse, but through the slow defeat of materials that were designed to last only as long as someone was replacing them when they degraded. A seal weakens, a seam opens, the gap is small, almost nothing, but it changes the air inside in a way that your entire body registers simultaneously. A new chemical signature, a different humidity, the particular complexity of outside air that has never been filtered or controlled, carrying information about a world that the glass has always excluded. And you move toward it, not quickly, not with anything resembling urgency, but with the deliberate and testing movement of an animal that navigates by sensing rather than seeing, each surface checked for stability, each new position evaluated before the next step. And eventually you pass through the gap, and the world on the other side is not larger in a way that frightens you, because you do not process scale the way that frightens. You process change, and change is everywhere. The air is dense with it, moving in ways that indoor air never moved, carrying layers of information that arrive simultaneously and require sorting. You find a surface, you anchor, you begin. Because beginning is what you do when you have a surface and an anchor. The web takes shape according to the logic your body carries, adapted already without knowing it toward the scale of prey that the enclosure taught you in its final weeks. Smaller, more numerous, more unpredictable in their movement, and the outside world is full of them. Full beyond anything the enclosure ever offered, even at its most productive. And you feed, and the feeding is sufficient, and sufficient is everything. Time passes in the way that time passes for something that does not track it. Seasons that you detect as pressure changes and prey behavior shifts, and the particular quality of air that moves differently in cold than in warmth. And you adapt to each of them through the same mechanism you have always used, position and web and patience and response. Years accumulate and you reproduce because the conditions allow it, and reproduction is what happens when conditions allow it. And your offspring inherit the web of behaviors that you refined and the web of silk that expresses those behaviors, and they disperse into an environment that is changing faster now than it has changed in a long time. Human structures decaying and vegetation expanding into the spaces they leave, and new ecological relationships forming between species that were previously separated by the managed landscape of a civilization that no longer exists. And your lineage spreads through this changing world carried by the same core logic that carried it through the enclosure, and through the gap, and through the first exposed weeks outside, which is that you find a position, you build a structure, you wait, you respond, you are efficient above all else. Generations pass and the efficiency is refined by the only process that refines anything, which is that the less efficient do not persist. The webs become more precisely calibrated for the prey populations they intercept. The positioning becomes more sophisticated in its reading of wind and structure and the movement patterns of the organisms that share the environment. Silk chemistry shifts subtly across generations toward properties that better serve the specific demands of each lineage's particular niche. Stronger for the ones building in exposed locations where wind is constant, stickier for the ones in dense environments where prey moves slowly through complex terrain and behavior diverges along with form. Some lineages abandon the fixed web entirely and become hunters, carrying their silk with them as a tool rather than building it as a home, faster, more mobile, trading the efficiency of the ambush for the flexibility of pursuit. Because the environment they inhabit rewards flexibility more than it rewards stillness. Others become more committed to the web than ever, constructing structures of increasing complexity in locations chosen with increasing precision, their entire existence organized around the perfection of a single strategy taken as far as it can go. Hundreds of years, and the divergence is pronounced. Thousands of years, and the descendants of what lived in your glass enclosure occupy niches that the enclosure never suggested were possible. Larger bodies in environments where larger prey is available, smaller bodies in environments where concealment is the primary survival tool. Sensory systems tune differently in different populations according to what the environment makes most useful. The ones in low light relying almost entirely on vibration. The ones in open environments developing sensitivity to air movement that amounts to a kind of distant touch, and somewhere in a landscape that has not been managed or maintained or controlled by anything. With intentions for longer than any living thing can remember, a web stretches between two surfaces that were once part of a building and are now part of a ruin that is becoming part of a forest. The geometry of it is not random. Every strand placed where the intersection of wind patterns and prey movement makes interception most probable, and at the center, something waits with the complete and total patience of an animal for which waiting is not a state between actions but the action itself. And a vibration arrives, specific, unmistakable, and the response is immediate and precise and does not involve anything that could be called thought, only the perfected expression of a capacity that was present in the glass enclosure and is present here and was present in everything between, and deep in the behavioral architecture of this animal, there is still a ghost, a slight preference for enclosed spaces, a bias toward anchoring in rigid structures, a tendency to orient toward corners. None of it meaningful now, none of it connected to anything that still exists. Just the residue of a world that ended without announcement, pressed so deep into behavior that it survived everything that came after it. Not because it was useful, but because it cost nothing to keep. And everything that followed the ending of that world was not a recovery or a rescue, but simply a continuation. The same logic expressed in a larger space. The same patience applied to a less predictable world. The same precision that made a small enclosure workable, making an entire changed planet workable. Because what you were inside the glass was never smaller than what you became outside it. It was only less visible, and when the glass was gone, the only thing that changed was that.